What if I told you there was an engine that made more torque than a modern diesel truck, yet came from an era when gas was 30 cents a gallon and seat belts were optional? An engine so understated in its horsepower claims that competitors laughed at the spec sheet, right until they saw the quarter-mile times. This is the story of how Oldsmobile engineers created one of the most deceptive power plants in automotive history, an engine that would redefine what torque meant in the muscle car era. I want you to picture this. It's 1970, and you're lined up at a stoplight in Detroit. Next to you sits a Plymouth Roadrunner with its legendary 446-pack, rated at 390 horsepower. The driver revs his engine, confident in his power advantage over your Oldsmobile 442 with its one-rush mirror 365 horsepower 455 cubic inch V8. The light turns green. He launches hard, but something unexpected happens. Your Oldsmobile doesn't just keep up. It pulls ahead with a surge of power that seems to defy physics. By the time you cross the intersection, you're a full car length ahead, and the Plymouth driver is left wondering what just happened. He had more horsepower on paper, but you had something far more valuable in the real world: 500 pound-feet of torque available from just 2,800 RPM on end-to-end. This wasn't supposed to happen. In the horsepower wars of the early 1970s, Oldsmobile's 455 V8 looked almost pedestrian on paper. While Chrysler was advertising 425 horsepower Hemis and Chevrolet was pushing 454s with similar claims, Oldsmobile quietly rated their biggest engine at just 365 horsepower in standard trim, maybe 370 on a good day. Some automotive journalists initially dismissed it as another also ran in the cubic inch race. They couldn't have been more wrong. To understand why the Oldsmobile 455 became a legend, despite its modest horsepower ratings, we need to travel back to 1964 to a conference room in Lansing, Michigan. General Motors had just imposed a corporate ban on engines larger than 400 cubic inches in intermediate cars, effectively killing the arms race before it started. But Oldsmobile engineers, led by Chief Engineer John Belts, had different ideas. They knew that winning on the street wasn't about peak horsepower at 6,000 RPM. It was about usable power where people actually drove. While other divisions chased high RPM horsepower for bragging rights, Oldsmobile would pursue something more practical and ultimately more devastating: massive, immediate torque. The development program that would create the 455 began in earnest in 1966. Oldsmobile engineers started with their existing 425 cubic inch V8, itself a derivative of the original 1964 330 cubic inch design. But rather than simply boring and stroking for more displacement like everyone else, they took a radically different approach. The team, including engineers Dick Jones and Dale Smith, focused on what they called our area under the curve, maximizing power across the entire RPM range rather than chasing a peak number. The key to their approach was the bore-to-stroke ratio. While Chevrolet's 454 used a 4.25-inch bore and a 4.0-inch stroke, and Chrysler's 440 ran a 4.2-inch bore with a 3.75-inch stroke, Oldsmobile went extreme. They opened up the bore to a massive 4.1 to 26 inches while keeping the stroke at just 4.25 inches. This might not sound like much of a difference, but in engine design, these fractions of an inch change everything. The larger bore allowed for bigger valves, 2.072 inches on the intake and 1.625 inches on the exhaust. These were huge for the era. The short stroke meant the pistons didn't have to travel as far, reducing stress and friction while allowing the engine to breathe more efficiently at lower RPM. But the real genius was in the cylinder heads. Oldsmobile's engineers had been refining their niche casting heads since 1968, and by 1970 they had achieved something remarkable. The intake ports were designed with what they called a upstate-controlled turbulence pattern. As air entered the combustion chamber, It would swirl in a specific pattern that promoted more complete combustion at lower engine speeds. The combustion chambers themselves were wedge-shaped, with a volume of 80 cc, creating a compression ratio of 10.5.1 with flat-top pistons. This was high enough for serious power, but still manageable with premium pump gas. Nensinen, the intake manifold, was another piece of engineering excellence. While other manufacturers were using cast iron intakes that heat-soaked and reduced charge density, Oldsmobile equipped the 455 with an aluminum dual-plane intake manifold. This kept the incoming air charge cooler and denser, improving combustion efficiency. The Quadrajet 4-barrel carburetor on top was specifically calibrated for the 455's characteristics, with larger secondary throttle plates and revised jetting that emphasized low-end fuel delivery. And the camshaft profile revealed Oldsmobile's true intentions. With just 0.472 inches of lift and 286 degrees of advertised duration, it was remarkably mild compared to the radical grinds other manufacturers were using. Chevrolet's L88 427, for comparison, used a cam with over 0.520 inches of lift and 326 degrees of duration. But Oldsmobile's engineers understood something their competitors had missed. A mild cam with proper timing created cylinder pressure at low RPM, and cylinder pressure creates torque. The bottom end of the 455 was built like a bank vault. The cast iron block featured 4-bolt main-bearing caps on positions 2, 3, and 4, the areas of highest stress. The crankshaft was forged steel, not cast iron like many competitors used. It weighed 76 pounds and was balanced to exacting tolerances. The connecting rods were forged steel units measuring 6.735 inches center to center. The pistons were cast aluminum with a unique dish design that promoted the swirl pattern initiated by the cylinder heads. When Oldsmobile dynoed the complete engine in early 1968, the results were staggering. At just 2,800 RPM, the 455 was producing its full 500 pound-feet of torque. To put that in perspective, a 2024 Ford F-250 diesel produces 500 pound-feet at 1,600 RPM, but that's with turbocharging and modern technology. The naturally aspirated 455 was achieving diesel-like torque figures with 1960s technology. Even more impressive, it maintained over 450 pound-feet from 2,000 all the way to 4,000 RPM. This wasn't a peaky engine that needed to be wound out. It was a sledgehammer that hit hard from idle to redline. The first production 455s rolled off the assembly line at Oldsmobile's Lansing facility in the fall of 1967 for the 1968 model year. They were initially available only in full-size Oldsmobiles like the 98 and Toronado. But enthusiasts and dealers immediately began clamoring for the engine in the mid-size 442. General Motors' displacement ban on intermediates was still in effect. But Oldsmobile found a loophole. They could offer the 455 as a special option through their Hurst partnership, creating the legendary Hurst Olds. The 1968 Hurst Olds was a revelation. Despite being rated at just 390 horsepower compared to the 425 horsepower Hemi Plymouth Roadrunners and 430 horsepower Cobra Jet Mustangs, the Hurst Olds consistently outperformed them in real-world acceleration tests. Car and Driver tested one in May 1968 and recorded a quarter-mile time of 13.9 seconds at 103 mph. That was faster than their tested times for the 427 Corvette, the Hemi Roadrunner, and the 428 Cobra Jet Mustang. The difference? While those engines needed to be revved to make power, the 455 just required you to mat the throttle and hold on. And George Hurst himself was quoted as saying the 455 "reader pulls like a Caterpillar D9 bulldozer from idle." The comparison was apt. The D9 bulldozer produces maximum torque at under 2,000 RPM and is designed to move massive loads from a standstill. That's exactly what the 455 did, just with a muscle car instead of dirt. Engine in by 1970, GM lifted its displacement ban, and the 455 became regular production option in the Ford 42 and Cutlass Supreme. This was the 455's glory year. In W30 specification, with Ram air induction and revised cam timing, the engine still claimed just 370 horsepower, but maintained its 500 pound-feet of torque. Independent testing by Superstock magazine revealed the truth. The W30 455 was actually producing closer to 420 horsepower at the flywheel. Oldsmobile was significantly underrating their engines, likely for insurance purposes. The 442 W30 with the 455 became one of the quickest muscle cars of the era. Hot Rod magazine tested one in March 1970 and achieved a 13th 33-second quarter mile at 107 mph with street tires and a full tank of gas. With slicks and proper tuning, times in the high 12s were common. These weren't just drag strip warriors either. The massive torque made them incredibly flexible on the street. You could cruise at 70 mph in top gear, floor the throttle, and accelerate to 100 mph without downshifting. Try that in a high-strung 427 Chevrolet or 426 Hemi. The 455's architecture made it remarkably reliable for such a powerful engine. The short stroke reduced piston speed and cylinder wall wear. At 6,000 RPM, the pistons in a 455 were traveling at the same speed as a Chevy 350 at 5,100 RPM. This lower piston speed meant less stress on the bottom end and longer engine life. Many 455s went over 100,000 miles without a rebuild, unusual for performance engines of the era. But it wasn't just straight-line performance where the 455 excelled. In the luxurious Toronado, the 455 had to deal with front-wheel drive and a curb weight of over 4,600 pounds. Yet even in this application, the massive torque made the Toronado surprisingly quick. Motor Trend tested a 1970 Toronado and recorded 0-60 mph in 8.2 seconds, remarkable for a luxury car that weighed as much as a modern Chevrolet Suburban TriStar. The 455 also found its way into some unexpected applications. In 1970, Oldsmobile installed it in the Vista Cruiser station wagon, creating one of the fastest family haulers ever built. Imagine Mom's surprise when the grocery getter could run 14-second quarter miles. There were even a handful of 455-powered Oldsmobile motorhomes built in 1973, though fuel economy concerns quickly killed that program. Speaking of fuel economy, the 455 was surprisingly efficient for its size. In highway cruising at 55 mph, a 455-powered Cutlass could achieve 14 miles per gallon. That's better than many modern performance cars with half the displacement. The secret was the torque curve. The engine could pull tall rear axle ratios like 2.81 or 3.081 and still have plenty of acceleration. At highway speeds, the engine would be loafing along at just 2,000 RPM, barely above idle. Yet the 455's unique characteristics made it a favorite among performance enthusiasts who understood what it offered. Dick Landy, the legendary drag racer, campaigned several 455-powered Oldsmobiles in pro stock. He once said, "As everyone else is trying to make their engines rev higher to make power. The 455 makes all its power before other engines even wake up." And the engine's design also made it incredibly responsive to modifications. A simple cam swap and header installation could push output to over 450 horsepower and 550 pound-feet of torque, while maintaining street manners. The stock bottom end could handle up to 600 horsepower reliably, making it a favorite for serious street racers. The large bore accommodated massive valves, and the short stroke meant the engine could rev safely to 6,500 RPM with proper valve springs. And production numbers tell the story of the 455's success. In 1970 alone, Oldsmobile built 96,156 engines with the 455. By the time production ended in 1976, over 500,000 had been manufactured. The engine appeared in everything from the compact F-85 to the massive 98 luxury sedan. It was Oldsmobile's universal solution to any performance need. And the 455's influence extended beyond Oldsmobile. Buick developed their own 455 using similar principles: large bore, short stroke, emphasis on torque. Even Pontiac's 455, while using a different architecture, followed the same philosophy. The success of these engines proved that the traditional American approach of bon marche, there's no replacement for displacement, could be refined into something more sophisticated. But changes were coming that would spell the end for the 455. The 1970 Clean Air Act began tightening emission standards. The 1973 oil crisis made fuel economy suddenly critical. Insurance companies were refusing to cover high-performance cars or charging premiums that exceeded car payments. By 1971, compression ratios were dropped to 8.5.1 to run on regular unleaded gas, and power dropped to 320 horsepower, though torque remained at 460 pound-feet. The addition of catalytic converters in 1975 further strangled output. The final 1976 455s were rated at just 190 horsepower, though they still produced 350 pound-feet of torque. It was a sad end for such a magnificent engine, neutered by regulations and changing times. The last 455 rolled off the assembly line in March 1976, ending a 9-year production run. But the 455's legacy lived on. The engine proved that clever engineering could triumph over brute force. While competitors relied on exotic valve trains, radical camshafts, and sky-high compression ratios that required race gas, Oldsmobile built an engine that made more usable power with regular premium fuel and conventional technology. The 455 influenced modern engine design, showing that torque, not horsepower, won races on the street. On Chen today, the 455 is highly sought after by collectors and restorers. A good used block commands $2,000 or more. Complete numbers-matching engines can exceed $10,000. The W30 versions are particularly valuable, with complete cars selling for over $150,000 at auction. Modern technology has only made the 455 better. With aluminum heads, roller camshafts, and electronic fuel injection, builders are getting 600 horsepower and 650 pound-feet of torque from naturally aspirated 455s while maintaining street drivability. On the Oldsmobile 455 stands as a testament to intelligent engineering over marketing hype. In an era when everyone was chasing bigger numbers on paper, Oldsmobile's engineers focused on what actually mattered, putting power to the pavement. They understood that torque, not horsepower, was what pushed you back in your seat. They recognized that an engine that made power at 2,800 RPM was more useful than one that made it at 5,800 RPM. The 455 proved that specifications don't tell the whole story. Despite being rated at just 365 horsepower in base form, it consistently outperformed engines claiming 60 or more additional horsepower. It showed that there was more to performance than peak numbers, that the area under the curve mattered more than the highest point on it. The 455 embarrassed supposedly superior engines from Chrysler, Ford, and even other GM divisions, not through exotic technology or racing heritage, but through careful, thoughtful engineering aimed at real-world performance. And in the end, the Oldsmobile 455 earned its place in the pantheon of great American engines, not through magazine racing or bench racing, but through thousands of victories at stoplights and drag strips across America. It was an engine that rewarded those who understood that torque was king, that low-end grunt beat high RPM screaming every time. The 455 was proof that sometimes the best solution isn't the most complex or expensive. It's the one that simply works better. The next time you see an old Cutlass or 442 at a car show, take a moment to appreciate what lies under that hood. It might not have the mystique of a Hemi or the fame of a big block Chevy, But that unassuming Oldsmobile 455 was one of the torquiest, most effective street engines ever built. It was Detroit engineering at its finest, not perfect, not exotic, but absolutely devastating where it counted. And that's exactly what Oldsmobile's engineers intended all along. Anson, what's your take on the torque versus horsepower debate? Have you ever experienced the punch of a big-inch torque motor? Drop a comment below and share your stories. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into one of Detroit's most underrated engines, make sure to subscribe because we're just getting started exploring the engineering marvels that changed automotive history.